The bin bag weighed more than seemed possible for something so ordinary. Camilla Sterling gritted her teeth, felt the black plastic slowly cut into the palm of her left hand, and kept walking down the white marble hallway of Kensington Manor, her eyes fixed on the end of the path, as she had learned to do in many situations throughout her 26 years. Focus on the destination. Ignore the pain, get there. It was her third day of work. She already knew the name of every employee, the location of every room, and that the rubbish disposal area was at the back of the garden, across a limestone path that received the morning sun and became warm in an almost pleasant way. Almost. Because that morning, with her arm throbbing and sweat trickling down her neck, the sensation of warmth was more suffocating than comforting. Camilla had woken up at 5 in the morning, as she did every morning. She prepared Marianne's snack, her 5-year-old daughter who slept hugging a stuffed rabbit with its nose sewn 3 times, because Marianne would not accept any suggestion of a replacement, and Camilla didn't have the heart to insist. She quickly braided the girl's hair before taking her to school at 6:20, took 2 buses, arrived at the mansion in the Belgravia neighborhood 15 minutes early, and started the day with that quiet determination of someone who knows that every hour worked carries the weight of a bill to pay and a dream still alive in some drawer of the heart. The incomplete pedagogue who became a domestic worker out of necessity, not lack of ambition. That was the phrase she used for herself on difficult nights, when exhaustion tried to convince her that there was no difference between who she was and what she was doing to survive. "Good heavens, haven't you reached it yet?" Rosalind Thorne's voice cut through the air like scissors through expensive silk. Camilla didn't need to turn around to know exactly what expression accompanied that tone. She knew the type. She had encountered variations of it in other jobs, in bank queues, in public institution waiting rooms, in that specific place where some people deposit the excess confidence they built at the expense of others' insecurity. She stopped, turned slowly. Rosalind Thorne was 38 years old, her silhouette the result of years of high-end gym memberships, her tan uniform from regularly visiting spas, and her sunglasses large enough to function as both shield and display simultaneously. She stood in the middle of the garden path with her arms crossed, and that specific posture of someone who expects to be obeyed even before finishing a sentence. Around them, the garden had fallen silent. Mr. Benedict, the 63-year-old gardener who had looked after the property for over 2 decades, had stopped mowing the lawn and pretended to be very busy, examining the handle of his pruning shears, his eyes discreetly raised from beneath the brim of his straw hat. Mrs. Irene, the 58-year-old cook, with an unwavering faith in the idea that God appears at the right time, had emerged at the kitchen window like someone smelling smoke before a fire, and disappeared again with the wisdom of someone who knows what's coming. "I apologize, Mrs. Thorne. The bag is a bit heavy today." "A bit," Rosalind said, descending the 2 steps from the veranda with calculated strides, each communicating something about hierarchy. "You were hired for domestic work, not to contemplate the garden as you walk. If a bin bag is defeating you, what exactly is your use here?" Camilla felt the heat rise in her chest. It wasn't the sun. It was that low, ancient flame she had learned to control during difficult years, when she had learned that reacting at the wrong time cost more than enduring. She counted mentally. 1, 2. She thought of Marianne drawing trees at school, with that serious concentration of someone who treats every scribble as an important work. 3. "I'm on my way to the disposal area, madam." Rosalind stepped closer. She lowered her sunglasses with 2 fingers and examined Camilla from head to toe with that expression used to assess suspicious merchandise. "Edward told me you have a university education. Incomplete, of course. Tell me something. What exactly do you learn at university that makes you unable to walk faster with a bin bag?" The word incomplete fell into the garden's silence like a stone in still water. Benedict had completely stopped pretending to work. His shears were motionless in his hand, his hat slightly tilted towards the side of the conflict. Camilla looked at Rosalind, counted further. 4, 5. She thought of the 5 o'clock alarm, of the 6:30 bus that sometimes didn't come, and she'd have to stand on crowded public transport for 40 minutes before getting to work. She thought of the notes she still kept from her second year of pedagogy, in a yellow plastic folder inside her wardrobe, because she couldn't throw away what had cost so much to build. "I'm going, madam." She took 2 steps. The plastic ripped slightly at the bottom corner of the bag, and the contents inside suddenly shifted, making the weight violently change sides. Camilla compensated, stumbled slightly, and the bag hit the side wall with a dry thud that echoed down the hallway. Rosalind's laugh was low and intimate, the kind that doesn't need volume to cut through. My God, Edward really thought this girl would manage. She spoke to the entire garden, as if Camilla were a defective object left in the wrong place. She turned to the gardener without hesitation. "Benedict, you do this route in 2 minutes. Have you considered sending her back and asking for a replacement?" Benedict didn't answer, but Camilla saw from the corner of her eye the 63-year-old man clench his jaw and look at the ground with the expression of someone swallowing something that shouldn't be swallowed. It was that silent gesture that broke something inside Camilla. Not the humiliation directed at her, which she had learned to carry along with other heavy things. It was seeing a man who had worked for 2 entire decades with respect and competence being used as a tool to diminish another person. It was realizing that this cruelty had reach, that it wasn't satisfied with just one target. She stopped. She placed the bin bag on the ground with deliberate calm, as if she were setting down something she had decided not to carry anymore. She straightened her spine, felt her feet firm on the warm marble, and turned her body completely towards Rosalind Thorne. There was a second of perfect silence in the garden. Rosalind lowered her sunglasses again, now with an eyebrow raised in an arch of anticipation, awaiting the spectacle of a subordinate trying to defend herself with a nervous voice and poorly articulated words. That was not what was coming. Camilla walked. She didn't run, didn't falter, didn't quicken her pace to get it over with. Each movement had the firmness of a decision that had been made long before that moment, perhaps years before, perhaps on that specific dawn when she lay staring at the ceiling with Marianne sleeping beside her, and decided there were things she was no longer willing to accept silently. Rosalind recoiled half a step, more by instinct than by choice. Camilla continued until the two were separated by less than a meter, and the discomfort in the socialite's eyes was visible even behind her sunglasses. "What do you think you're doing?" The certainty in her voice had lost a tone. "I'm looking you in the eye," Camilla said calmly. "Just that for now." "You're forgetting who you're talking to." Rosalind's voice tried to regain its altitude. "I can fire you right now. I can ensure you don't work in any other house in this neighborhood, in any neighborhood in this city." Camilla took a deep breath, felt the air enter, expand her ribs, slowly exit. She felt the sun on her back and the scent of jasmine from the climbing plants she had never properly stopped to notice until that moment. And then, in a movement that came from a place so honest it could not be calculated, Camilla's right palm met Rosalind Thorne's face. It wasn't a blow of anger. It was precise, delimited, a boundary established in the only language that moment seemed to clearly understand. The silence that followed was of a different quality. Benedict had dropped his shears on the grass. Irene had returned to the window, and this time did not disappear. From a branch above their heads, a blackbird called once and then fell silent, as if also waiting for what would come next. Rosalind stood with her hand on her own face. She looked at Camilla with an expression Rosalind herself had probably never worn before. Genuine surprise, without layers, without protection. The expression of someone who had believed for years that certain things simply didn't happen to them. Camilla opened her mouth and began to speak. "You can take this job from me." Her voice was firm, low, without a tremor. "You can call every employer on this street and tell them whatever you want about me, but you cannot take what I built by myself, on my knees, with money that sometimes wasn't enough, and courage that had to be invented from scratch every day." Rosalind remained motionless, her hand still on her face. "I have a 5-year-old daughter who waits for me every night. Her name is Marianne. She sleeps hugging a stuffed rabbit with its nose sewn 3 times because she refuses to throw away what she loves. And looking at her, I learned that this is the only way to face life with dignity." Camilla paused. "I wake up at 5 in the morning so she never has to feel ashamed, so she never feels what I am feeling now. I work with pride, not because I have no choice, but because I choose to do what needs to be done with pride." Camilla's voice rose a note, controlled, like someone climbing stairs and counting each one. "The difference between us is not the address. It's not the surname. It's that I still know how to treat people like people. And you, with everything you have, lost that somewhere along the way. And that, Mrs. Thorne, is something no cleaning service or beauty salon can fix." In that garden of marble and jasmine, in complete silence, none of the people present breathed for an entire moment. Rosalind recomposed her face inch by inch, like someone replacing a mask that had fallen to the ground. When she spoke, her voice tried to be ice and sounded like glass about to crack. "You're fired. All of you are fired." And it was then that Benedict stepped forward, his pruning shears still hanging in his hand, his 63 years entirely on his shoulders, and said with the calm voice of someone who had held those words for a long time, waiting for the right moment to use them. Benedict had been 63 years old, and 21 of those years spent in that garden. He knew each rosebush by the name he had invented for them throughout the seasons. He knew in which month the bougainvillea at the entrance would bloom most generously, which corner of the wall needed attention before the October rains, and exactly where the afternoon sun struck with enough force to kill the most fragile seedlings if care wasn't taken. In that garden, Benedict had buried seeds, expectations, and more than one dream that had needed to be relearned in a different way. That morning, as he held the pruning shears with both hands, unsure of what to do with them, he reviewed all the things he had witnessed in that space over 2 decades. He came to a silent and definitive conclusion. He had never seen anything like it, and it was time not to stand still. He took a step forward. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, the kind people plan in front of a mirror. It was the natural step of someone who had spent 6 decades learning that there is an exact moment when standing still is morally identical to turning your back. And Benedict had never turned his back on anything that truly mattered. "Rosalind," he said the name without Mrs., as he had said it during all the years when that address had made sense to him. There was something in a name spoken without adornments that communicates more than any title. "I worked here before you arrived, and Camilla is one of the most dedicated workers who has passed through this house in my 21 years here." Rosalind turned to him with the specific expression reserved for unwelcome interruptions. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Benedict." "You didn't," he agreed, his eyes firm beneath the brim of his straw hat. "But 21 years on this land give me at least the right to speak once, and I choose to speak now." On the other side of the garden, through the kitchen window, Irene had abandoned the aluminium tray on the counter with a soft clatter. She was 58 years old, had raised 4 children, had 3 grandchildren who arrived every week asking for cake, and possessed a deep and practical faith in the idea that God is everywhere, but sometimes needs flesh and blood people to appear in moments that matter. She took off her apron, folded it on the countertop, and headed towards the back door with the determination of someone who had answered a call. "Mrs. Irene doesn't need to get involved in this," Rosalind warned, noticing the movement. "I'm already involved," the cook said, arriving in the garden and planting her feet on the grass next to Benedict, with the solidity of someone who is exactly where they need to be. "This girl didn't do anything that I myself haven't wanted to do at other times in my life." Rosalind looked at the 3 of them, Camilla, with her back straight and her eyes dry despite everything, Benedict, his shears still in hand, and the permanent calm of those who have seen much, Irene, with her arms crossed and that expression her children would immediately recognize as the final warning before the storm. She recomposed her posture, took a breath, and said with the aplomb of someone who still believes the rules of the game work in their favor, "Very well, you're all fired. I'm calling Edward right now to ensure each of you leaves this property today." "You won't need to." The voice came from the side entrance of the garden, where the covered pathway met the stone veranda. It was a calm voice without apparent anger, but with the specific weight of someone who knows that what they are about to say will change something permanently. Edward Kensington was 35 years old, his skin tanned like someone who had spent his childhood in the countryside before coming to the city, and brown eyes that people generally described as kind when he was relaxed and unreadable when he had made a decision. That morning, as he emerged from behind the stone column and crossed the path of light and shadow towards the garden, they were both things at once. Rosalind turned to him with a smile that appeared too quickly, too constructed, with 2 years of practice in being what the situation demanded. "Edward, how good of you to arrive. You need to see what this girl did to me." "I saw," he said, stopping in the middle of the garden with his hands in his pockets. "I saw everything, Rosalind, for a while now." The smile faltered. Just a tenth of a second, just a crack in the veneer, but Camilla was watching and noticed. "Edward, she physically assaulted me. I demand that you take action right now. She needs to be held accountable. This cannot go without consequence." Edward looked at his girlfriend for a moment that stretched beyond comfortable. Then he turned his eyes to Camilla, read her face carefully, glanced at Benedict, at Irene, at the entire garden that had been the stage for that morning. When he looked back at Rosalind, there was something different in his expression, like someone who had finished reading a long text and finally understood what was written. "Camilla," he said her name with a naturalness that surprised Camilla herself, as if he had known it before. "I'm sorry." Rosalind opened her mouth. Edward slightly raised his hand, not to silence her, but to ask for just a moment. "I'm sorry for having allowed this to happen here, for not paying attention to what was happening in my own home, with people who work for me and who deserve respect." He took a deep breath. "This was my negligence, and I regret it." "Edward," Rosalind's voice had risen a tone, "you are defending an employee who just assaulted me against me. Do you understand what you're doing?" "I'm doing what I should have done before." He looked at her without harshness, but also without backing down. "You humiliated this woman in front of everyone. You used Benedict, who has 21 years of dedication to this house, as an instrument to diminish another person. What Camilla did came from someone at the absolute limit of what is possible to endure. And that limit, Rosalind, you built." "2 years," she said, lowering her voice to something that tried to be intimate. "2 years together, and you choose her side." "I'm choosing what is right." Edward didn't avert his eyes. "And I discovered this morning that I should have done so more often before." There was a moment of total silence. The blackbird sang again up above, 2 notes, and stopped. "I loved a version of you that perhaps never existed." Edward's voice was serene, with the specific sadness of things that are hard to say, because they are true. "I cannot build anything real with someone capable of this. I need you to leave, Rosalind." She remained motionless for a moment, that seemed too long to be bearable. Then she retrieved her sunglasses with a precise gesture, raised her chin for the second time that morning, with a dignity that was the only genuine thing she had displayed in the entire scene, and turned her body towards the hallway. Her steps on the marble were measured, controlled, the soundtrack of an exit she needed to seem like a choice. When the sound of her heels disappeared down the hallway, the garden let out the air it had held. Irene closed her eyes for 2 seconds and opened them again, with that expression of someone silently thanking for something they hadn't expected to receive so clearly. Benedict slightly inclined his head towards Edward, the equivalent of an entire speech for a man of few words. Camilla looked at her own hands. She still felt the tingling in her palm. There was a knot in her neck that hadn't completely dissolved, despite everything that had happened. The residual tension of a morning that had demanded more from her than she had calculated when waking at 5. She knew, with the silent certainty of perceptions that arrive unannounced, that something had permanently changed in that garden. That the space she had known for 3 days was different now, and that she was different within it. What she didn't yet know was the full extent of what was growing. Edward turned to her with an expression that was slightly out of place on a man accustomed to boardrooms and high-stakes decisions. Something almost shy, disarmed, human in a way the formality of the setting didn't prepare one to see. "There's fresh coffee in the kitchen," he said, "and I'd very much like to hear about Marianne if you're willing." Camilla looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Benedict, who had started to gather his pruning shears with a small smile directed at the grass. Then at Irene, who was already turning her back towards the kitchen with the determination of someone about to prepare coffee for an important conversation. "I'm willing," Camilla said. And as she entered through the back door of Kensington Manor that morning, She felt for the first time in a long while that the weight she carried was beginning, very slowly, to find the right place to rest. On the afternoon of the same Thursday that Rosalind Thorne left Kensington Manor through the main gate for the last time, Edward gathered Camilla, Benedict and Irene in the dining room. It was a room that had hosted businessmen, commercial partners, and gala guests over the years, and it seemed to take a discreet pause upon seeing those three people seated around the solid wood table with cups of coffee prepared by Irene, with the care reserved for occasions that matter. Edward announced Camilla's new contract without preamble, with the objectivity of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it out. Tripled salary. Camilla remained silent for a second that stretched as she processed the number. Full health insurance for her and Marianne. She blinked faster than usual. The fund for resuming her university studies was what caused the lump to appear in her throat. In that specific way that happens when someone delivers exactly what you had stopped asking for, because you had learned that wishing aloud was more painful than not having it. "You don't need to answer now," Edward said, noticing. "No," Camilla lightly shook her head. "I accept. Thank you." She breathed, reorganizing her emotions back to where she could manage them. "And you can meet Marianne if you'd like. She'll love the garden." Edward's smile was discreet but genuine. Irene, who had served the coffee with the discretion of someone who understands that there are moments when the best contribution is silence, also smiled into her own cup. Benedict, who had listened to everything with a straight back and hands in his lap, simply said, "Well done," in a way that served as both a comment on the decision and a compliment at the same time. No one asked for clarification. Edward also announced the hiring of a human resources consultancy to restructure the house's policies, focusing on respect, clarity of roles and channels for any employee to report problems without fear of reprisal. Benedict listened to this with the careful attention of someone who knows that real change isn't in the announcements, but in what happens in the following weeks. He would keep an eye out. In the days that followed, Edward began to do a small thing that produced a greater effect than any formal meeting could have. He started having breakfast in the kitchen. He came down earlier than usual for the first time on a Monday, found Irene finishing preparing the cheese buns, and asked, with a naturalness she took a moment to believe was real, if he could sit there while she finished. Irene said he could, and spent the first 20 minutes adjusting and readjusting the position of things around the stove, more often than necessary. On Tuesday, she was less tense and mentioned her youngest son, Theo, who was trying to pass his university entrance exam for the third time and who had called on Sunday with an enthusiasm for biology that she still wasn't sure whether to interpret as a good sign or as dilettantism. Edward listened attentively and asked about the course Theo wanted, in a way that wasn't social protocol. It was genuine curiosity. On Thursday, Benedict had joined them before heading to the garden, and the conversation had lasted 45 minutes without anyone noticing the time passing. Camilla arrived at 7:30. It took her a few days to stop being overly formal on those kitchen mornings, to stop calculating every word before speaking. Edward helped by consistently being himself, without any performance of generosity, just present and curious, asking questions about each person's routines and stories with the attention of someone who had realized there were entire worlds beside him that he had never bothered to see. On one of these mornings, as Irene expounded on the best way to make homemade clotted cream, and Benedict listened with the expression of someone who was going to test the recipe but wouldn't admit it, Edward looked at Camilla and said slowly, "You mentioned pedagogy the other day." She raised her eyes from her cup. "I started the course, dropped out in my second year when Marianne was born. What happened?" "The finances didn't add up," she said with the direct simplicity of someone who had moved past feeling ashamed of the arithmetic of poverty. "Single mother, no nearby support network. I had to choose between studying and ensuring the basics. I chose the basics. And now?" She looked at her cup for a moment. "Now the numbers have changed." 3 weeks after that morning in the garden, Marianne visited the manor for the first time. Camilla had hesitated before accepting the invitation. There was an invisible boundary she still didn't quite know how to navigate, a keen awareness that what was happening there was beautiful but also fragile, and that fragile things break when held with the wrong pressure at the wrong time. But Marianne was 5.5 and had spent the entire week asking about the garden her mother described every night before bed, about the gentleman named Benedict, who gave names to the plants, about whether there were butterflies. There were butterflies. Many. Mariana entered through the side gate, hand in Camilla's hand, and stopped in the middle of the garden with her mouth open. The specific expression of children who haven't yet learned that astonishment should be controlled in public. Benedict was waiting with a bougainvillea seedling and a small orange plastic spade he had bought the previous afternoon without mentioning it to anyone, and he greeted the girl with the naturalness of someone who had spent decades living with things that grow at their own pace. "What flower is that?" Marianne pointed to the climbing plants on the wall. "Bougainvillea," Benedict said, slowly kneeling with knees that ached in the cold. "This one is 13 years old. When I planted it, your mother was still your age." Marianne processed this information with applied seriousness. "Can I plant one too?" "Yes, you can, but you'll have to come water it. Plants don't grow without attention. Like people." Benedict looked at her. "Like people," he confirmed. Edward had arrived earlier that afternoon without prior notice and was on the veranda when he saw the scene in the garden. He stood there for a moment without descending, watching Marianne dig a hole with the orange spade, Benedict kneeling beside her with infinite patience and instructions on depth and distance from the wall, and Camilla standing slightly behind with her arms crossed and an expression he immediately recognized, though he had never had words for it. Pure love without any shadow, the most honest form of any feeling. He descended. Marianne assessed him with the objectivity of small children, scanning him from head to toe without any embarrassment. "Are you the owner of the garden?" "I am." "Why do you have so much space for so few people?" Edward was quiet for a second. He looked at the garden, at the immense lawn, at the rose bushes in rows, at the back area that served as a storage for furniture no one used. He thought of an honest answer for a child who deserved honesty. "That's a good question," he said. "I'm trying to figure out what to do with it." Marianne returned to the bougainvillea, seemingly satisfied with the answer. That night, after Camilla took her daughter home with dirt on her knees and the memory of butterflies, Edward stayed in the garden late. He sat on the wooden bench beside the rosebush Benedict called Alzira, for reasons he had never fully explained, and looked at the new bougainvillea seedling Marianne had planted, too small yet to know it would grow. The phone rang. It was Ronald Villiers, one of the group's founding partners, his voice sounding professional even when conveying poorly disguised concern. "Edward, we need to talk urgently. The other partners have requested an in-person meeting." "For about what?" "Better in person." Edward was silent for a moment. He knew without needing to ask what it was about. Rumors spread quickly in these circles, where everyone had known each other since childhood, and where a separation was never simply a separation. It was an event to be interpreted, commented on, used. "Tomorrow at 10, Edward said. "My office." He hung up. He looked at the bougainvillea seedling for another moment. He thought of Marianne asking why there was so much space for so few people. And he realized, with the clarity of things that seem obvious once they arrive, that the answer he was looking for wasn't a business answer. It was an answer of purpose. The Kensington Group's boardroom had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Oxford Street, the kind of view designed to remind the people sitting there that they were above something and needed to act accordingly. Edward had presided over hundreds of meetings in that space over 12 years and knew every possible dynamic, the calculated silences, the alliances formed between a coffee and a glass of water, the moments when someone said exactly the opposite of what they thought, and everyone pretended to agree with the performance. There were 4 men around the table that morning besides him. Ronald Villiers, 62 years old, a founding partner alongside Edward's father, with completely white hair and a clinical ability to transform any ethical issue into a strategic one without appearing cynical. He was the man who had taught Edward about the difference between a company that grows and a company that lasts, and whose wisdom Edward had admired for a long time without questioning the values that sustained it. Marcus Uchida, 58, responsible for the group's international relations, who only attended meetings when he considered the matter serious enough to warrant his physical presence. The fact that he was there said more than any formal agenda. Peter Augustus Salavea, 49, the most recent of the partners, who had joined the group by marrying Ronald's daughter and who rarely formed his own opinion before checking what Ronald's was. He sat with a pen in his hand that he handled without writing anything, and Frederick Lawson, 55, whom Edward had genuinely considered a friend at some point in the last 10 years. Frederick had an intelligence Edward respected, and a tendency towards pragmatism that Edward had long confused with maturity. Edward arrived precisely at 10. He served himself coffee, greeted each one with his usual cordiality, and sat at the head of the table with no rush to begin. "Thank you for coming," and he said. "Edward." Ronald clasped his hands on the table with the composure of someone who had prepared for this conversation. "Let's be direct, because we've known each other too long for pleasantries. Rumors are circulating rapidly. Rosalind has spoken to many people. I imagine. She's saying you had some kind of crisis, that you ended a 2-year relationship to defend a domestic employee who assaulted your girlfriend." Ronald paused. "Do you understand the impact this narrative has?" "Her version is creative," Edward said calmly. "The reality is this. I ended a relationship after personally witnessing the deliberate humiliation of my employee and of people who have worked for me for decades. The employee in question did not assault anyone gratuitously. She reacted in a situation of moral harassment that I should have prevented earlier, and instead of pretending I didn't see, I chose to do what was right." There was a silence that had the texture of discomfort. "Edward," Frederick spoke with a caution that seemed sincere, "no one here is judging your personal choices. But you need to understand the concrete effect on the group. There are contracts in the final stages of negotiation with partners who have close connections with Rosalind's family. The perception forming in the market is one of instability." "Instability," Edward repeated the word as if examining it. "Help me understand the reasoning. I ended a relationship for ethical reasons. I recognized and corrected an unjust situation that occurred on my property. I began to have a more human relationship with the people who have worked with me for decades. At what point in this does instability appear?" In the timing, Marcus Uchida spoke for the first time, with the precision of someone who chooses words for specific purposes. "In the rupture with the social connections we have built over decades, and in the way you are directing the narrative, which seems to prioritize the emotional narrative over the strategic one." "Prioritizing ethics over strategy," Edward corrected softly. "That is different. To the market, it might seem the same thing. Then the market needs to be corrected." Edward placed his coffee cup on the table with a calm that was itself a declaration. "You are asking me to do damage control. This means, in practice, that I should apologize to Rosalind for what I did, minimize what happened with my employee, and prioritize social appearances over ethical behavior. Is that it?" No one answered. "Then my answer is no." He looked around the table. "You live in a very well-constructed bubble. I lived inside it too. But I've left and I have no intention whatsoever of going back in." He leaned forward slightly. "If there are contracts that depend on me betraying my conscience, those contracts were never truly secure. They were loans with moral interest that hadn't yet come due. I prefer to lose those contracts now than to pay that interest later." Ronald looked at Edward for a long moment. There was something on the older partner's face that was no longer entirely the executive veneer. It was something older, more human, that tried not to appear and wasn't entirely succeeding. "And the group?" Ronald asked. "What happens to what we built together?" "The group continues, with integrity or without me." Edward stood up. "If your conclusion is that I no longer serve as a principal partner under these conditions, I accept the consequences, but I will not buy peace with my soul." He walked to the door. "Edward," Ronald's voice stopped him. There was a small crack in the veneer visible now. "Your father built this group with a rule he always repeated whenever I tried to take a shortcut." Edward stood with his back to them, waiting. "He used to say, 'A business that cannot withstand the truth does not deserve to continue.'" Edward stood still for a moment. He felt that phrase land on him the way ancient truths land when they arrive at the right time. "I know," he said, and left. That afternoon, back at the manor, Edward found Camilla in the second-floor reading room, reorganizing the shelves with that careful methodology he had already learned to recognize in her. Each thing finding its right place, unhurriedly, with attention to what each object deserved. She had a pedagogy book in her hand when he arrived at the door. She had taken it from a pile with quick recognition before holding it, like someone finding a familiar face after a long time. "Do you want to keep it?" Edward asked. She looked at the book, at him, back at the book. "It's part of the second semester curriculum, which you're going to resume." "Which I am going to resume," she said, and the sentence came out whole and firm, with no doubt dressed as affirmation. Edward leaned against the doorframe. "I had a complicated meeting today." "And how did it go?" "I refused to do damage control," he said, "and I feel lighter than I expected." Camilla looked at him for a moment with that direct attention she had, the quality of someone who listened to understand, not to reply. "Have you ever thought about working in education?" Edward said. "Not as a domestic employee, as an educator, as a coordinator." He looked at the space of the manor that existed around them. "There's a lot of wasted space here. A 5-year-old girl asked me why there's so much space for so few people. I'm trying to find the right answer." Camilla was quiet. It was the silence of an idea that had long been stored somewhere deep and was beginning very slowly to rise. "What kind of thing are you thinking of?" she asked. And Edward, for the first time in a long while, answered without knowing the end of the sentence before he began, and that, he realized, was exactly the sign that he was on the right path. The idea took 2 months to move from the reading room doorframe to become a real blueprint on the kitchen table. It took another 3 months for the blueprint to become construction work, with rubble and paint and the smell of plaster that Benedict declared to be the smell of something serious happening. And it took 6 months in total, counted from that morning of marble and bin bags, for the Roots Community Centre to open its doors for the first time on an April afternoon. With the scent of fresh paint mixed with the orange cake Irene had baked generously enough to feed an entire neighborhood. The name had been Marianne's. Edward had asked for suggestions on one of those kitchen coffee mornings, with the naturalness of someone who includes everyone in building something that belongs to all. Marianne, who was there because Camilla had brought her daughter that Saturday morning, thought for exactly 30 seconds with the applied seriousness that was her trademark. "Roots," she said. "Why roots?" Edward asked. "Because a root is what holds the tree when it's very windy." "Yes," she replied, with the conviction of someone explaining something obvious to adults who are slow to understand. Benedict had blown his nose with that discretion that was in fact very well practiced indiscretion. Irene had turned to the stove with a sudden urgency to stir a pot that didn't need stirring. Edward had taken the napkin he had in his hand and written the name on it with the ink from the pen in his pocket, and that napkin had gone into a folder that remained on the table during all the planning meetings that followed. The Roots Centre occupied the service block of the property, a set of rooms that had served as storage for years, holding forgotten furniture and equipment that belonged to decisions no one remembered making anymore. Edward hired an architect named Sonia Takahashi, specializing in social impact renovations, who worked for 4 months on the project with an attention to detail that transformed the space without erasing what it had been. The brick walls were kept exposed. The old wooden windows were restored, not replaced. The result was a place that seemed to have always existed, just waiting for the right people to arrive and inhabit it. Camilla had enrolled in the pedagogy degree in March, mid-semester, with a quiet determination that professors described in corridor conversations as impressive for someone returning after years of a break. She herself described it as natural. When conditions change, you do what you always knew you were meant to do. She attended classes 3 times a week in the afternoons and organized the rest of her time with that quiet efficiency of someone who learned to do a lot with little and doesn't waste abundance when it arrives. Marianne was in a full-time school near the manor, and some afternoons she spent hours in the garden with Benedict, learning the names of plants and the cycles of the seasons with the seriousness of an apprentice who takes the work seriously. Benedict treated her as an apprentice without condescension, explaining the reasons behind everything he did and expecting her to understand. Benedict had taken over the maintenance supervision of the center, with the seriousness of someone receiving a responsibility that was both a promotion and recognition. He created a system of conservation routines that was rigorous and completely accessible, because Benedict had learned over decades that knowledge that cannot be passed on is wasted knowledge. "Everything I know," he told Edward one morning, "I learned from someone who took the trouble to explain. That's all I'm doing." Irene had accepted the position of nutrition coordinator with an initial formality that lasted approximately 3 days before transforming into practical enthusiasm. She appeared at planning meetings with her recipe notebook and ideas about a community garden that no one had formally asked for, but that everyone had immediately incorporated because they made absolute sense. "No professional training works properly with poorly fed people," she said at a meeting, like someone presenting an irrefutable argument. No one argued. The center's first classes were made up of 22 students, domestic workers from the region and surrounding areas, who attended the professional qualification courses that Camilla had designed with the help of partner professors from the university. The material was practical and respectful, built on the premise that the people who arrived there already knew a great deal and needed organization, formal recognition, and vocabulary to name what they already did well. In the first week of operation, Edward asked to sit at the back of one of the classes as an observer. Camilla had agreed with that slightly amused expression that appeared when she saw him try to minimize his own presence in an environment, as if the owner of the property could somehow go unnoticed in a room of 15 people. But she allowed it, and he stayed until the end, listening to each student with the attention of someone who discovers there was an entire world happening a meter away from him, and he had never stopped to listen. During the break, one of the students, Mrs. Constance, a 61-year-old laundress who had worked her entire life without ever receiving a document that formally named what she did, approached Edward with the simple directness of someone who sees no reason for circumlocution. "Are you the owner of this place?" "I am." "Why did you do this?" Edward thought carefully before answering. "Because I should have." Mrs. Constance looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said, and returned to her seat. Edward carried that answer in his chest for the rest of the afternoon. 2 days before the first graduation ceremony, Camilla received a call she wasn't expecting. It was Frederick Lawson. "Camilla, I apologize for contacting you directly. I got your number from Edward." His voice was different from the corporate version she had imagined him to have. More direct, more human, with the specific weight of someone saying something that took time to formulate. "I wanted to know if I could attend the graduation." She was silent for a second. "Why?" "Because I was on the wrong side in that meeting. I remained silent when I should have spoken." A pause. "That bothered me more than I expected, and I needed to say it to someone who was at the center of what happened." Camilla looked at the brick wall of the center's corridor for a moment. She thought of the morning in the garden, the heavy bin bag, the tingling in her palm. She thought of the 6 months that had transformed that weight into something worth carrying. "You can come," she said. "The ceremony is at 4. There will be orange cake." Frederick exhaled. "Thank you, Camilla." She hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment, with the students' posters on the brick walls. The wooden windows opened to the garden where Marianne's bougainvillea seedling was growing, 2 pink flowers already open. Edward appeared at the corridor entrance with 2 cups of coffee, the expression of someone trying to appear casual and only partially succeeding. "Frederick is coming." "I know," she said, taking one of the cups. "I allowed it." "How are you?" Camilla considered the question with honesty. She didn't answer it quickly, the way people respond when they're not truly listening to the question. She held it for a second before replying. "I'm very well, Edward," she said. "I'm very well in a way I haven't been for a long time." And that sentence, spoken with that simplicity, in that brick corridor with the smell of coffee and bougainvillea growing outside, was the most beautiful thing Edward had heard in months. The graduation morning began with a fine drizzle, the kind of rain that in the English countryside they call a blessing, and that in London people usually call annoying. But the drizzle stopped at 2 in the afternoon, with the punctuality of a well-behaved guest, And when 4 o'clock arrived, the root center garden was dry and fragrant with petrichor and jasmine, and filled with white plastic chairs arranged in rows that Benedict had organized with the precision of someone who treats symmetry as a form of respect. 22 graduates came. Their families came. Children, husbands, mothers who had grown old carrying brooms and cloths, and who now sat in those white chairs with the specific posture of someone still learning that they have a right to be in a place like that. 3 professors from the partner university came, who had participated in the curriculum's construction and arrived with the lightness of someone who recognizes when an idea has worked beyond expectation. Frederick Lawson came through the side gate, discreetly, standing at the back until Irene, without any ceremony, handed him a chair and pointed to a middle row with the authority of someone who manages spaces. And Marianne came. She was 6 years and 3 months old that afternoon. Her hair was tied in 2 braids with yellow ribbon that Camilla herself had done that morning with the precision of a person who treats small details as applied love. She wore a blue dress she had chosen herself because it was, according to her, the color of the sky when it's thinking of being beautiful. She was sitting in the front row next to Benedict, with a folded paper in her hand that she had held since breakfast without letting it crease, which represented a considerable feat for a 6-year-old. The ceremony began with Camilla at the microphone. She had rewritten the speech 4 times. In the 5th version, she had abandoned her notes and decided simply to speak of what truly mattered, which was the only way she knew how to speak when the subject was genuinely serious. 6 months ago, she said to the people gathered in that garden, with the late afternoon sun casting a golden light over the white chairs and attentive faces. I was carrying a bin bag that was too heavy, and I thought the weight was my problem, that there was something wrong with me for not being able to carry it without feeling it. She paused. I discovered that weight shared with respect is not weight. It's just work, and work done with dignity is one of the most beautiful things in the world. There was a silence of assent, the kind that doesn't need applause to communicate its arrival. Each of the 22 graduates received their certificate from Camilla's hands. She had asked each person to say a word about what they were taking home, not necessarily about technical content, but about what the center had given them beyond the class hours. The answers came with a direct and unadorned vocabulary that didn't try to impress anyone. Respect, voice, time, value, our pride, courage, myself, the right name for what I always knew how to do. When Mrs. Constance, the 61-year-old laundress, reached the microphone to receive her certificate, she stood for a moment looking at the paper with her own name printed on it. She raised her eyes to Camilla. I'd never seen my name on a document like this, she said. That says I know how to do something. She folded the certificate with extreme care, as if it were a treasure map, and returned to her seat with the posture of someone who had grown 2 invisible centimeters. Edward was sitting in the last row next to Irene, who had finally handed the microphone to another volunteer and was allowed to be just a guest for the rest of the afternoon. He listened to every word with the total attention of someone who knows they are witnessing something that will last longer than the day, longer than himself. When it was Marianne's turn, she climbed the 2 steps of the small stage Benedict had built with reclaimed timber, unfolded the paper with slow care, and read with the clear voice of someone who had rehearsed enough not to need the text anymore, but used it anyway because she had agreed she would. I want to talk about kind people, she said. My mum told me that kindness is when you treat someone the way you'd want to be treated. I think kindness is bigger than that. She looked at the paper, then back at the garden. Kindness is when you treat someone well even when no one is looking, because you know it's right, even if no one sees, even if it costs you something. She folded the paper with the seriousness of someone concluding an important argument. Mr. Benedict is kind because he cares for the plants as if they had names and feelings, Mrs. Irene is kind because she cooks in a way that makes people feel at home even when they're not. She paused like a good speaker. My mum is the kindest of all because she was kind even when they tried to be cruel to her. She looked at Edward with that 6-year-old objectivity that was impossible to escape. And Edward is learning too. The laughter that came from the garden was warm and spontaneous, the laughter of people who recognize truth and feel relieved when someone says it aloud. Edward covered his mouth with his hand, His eyes were sparkling in a way he didn't try to control. Irene said "Good heavens" in a low voice and looked at the corridor ceiling like someone registering a point in a decades-long conversation with the heavens. Frederick Lawson, in the middle of the audience, clapped with everyone else but stayed a second longer than the others, like someone paying an overdue bill and feeling that an extra effort is the minimum appropriate. After the ceremony, when the garden had transformed into a space for conversation and orange cake and children running between the chairs, Frederick walked up to Edward with the determination of someone who had made a decision before arriving and wouldn't change his mind. "You didn't have a breakdown," Frederick said directly, without preamble. "You found a real purpose. I needed to tell you that personally, not over the phone, not in a meeting." Edward looked at him for a moment. "And you still want to stay on the safe side?" Frederick considered this with honesty. "I'm finding that the safe side has become too small to fit in." Edward extended his hand. Frederick shook it with the firmness of someone sealing more than just a handshake. Later, when the sun had finished setting behind the stone wall and the garden was in that golden late afternoon light that makes everything seem painted with intention, Edward found Camilla sitting on the bench beside the rosebush Benedict called Alzira. Her eyes were on the bougainvillea seedling Marianne had planted months before, which was now almost 30 centimeters tall with 3 pink flowers open. Edward sat beside her. They remained silent for a moment that had no hurry to end. "I have a proposal," he said. Camilla turned to him with a slightly raised eyebrow, the expression of someone who had learned to listen before reacting. "I want to expand the center at a primary school, partnership with the Department of Education, its own curriculum, with the methodology built upon what you've learned here and what you'll learn in your next 2 years of pedagogy." He breathed. "And I want you to be the pedagogical director. Not because you're available, but because you're the right person." Camilla was quiet for a moment that was long enough for Edward to realize he had been holding his breath without noticing. "I'm still at university," she said. "I know. The project will start operating when you graduate. In 2 years, the foundations will be ready, and the position will be waiting." She looked at the bougainvillea. She thought of Marianne, who was on the other side of the garden with Benedict, teaching the names of plants to 2 of the graduates' children with the authority of a 6-year-old expert. She thought of the 5 in the morning, the buses, the rabbit with the sewn nose, the notes in the yellow folder she still kept in her wardrobe. She thought of how everything that had seemed too heavy had, with time and with the right people beside her, become part of a structure that held much more than she herself had calculated. "Give me a day to think about it," she said. "You can give me a week." "I don't need a week." She looked at him with that slightly amused expression that appeared when she wanted to be honest without being abrupt. "I needed a day so it wouldn't seem like I accept everything you propose without thinking it through." A pause. "I accept, Edward." He let out the breath he had been holding without realizing. At that moment, Marianne came running through the garden with her braids half undone and the yellow ribbon flying in one hand, stopping in front of the 2 with the complete objectivity of a 6-year-old who sees no reason to soften anything. "Are you happy?" she asked Edward directly, without preamble or hesitation. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought of the Oxford Street boardroom and the floor-to-ceiling windows and the decades of connections built on appearances. He thought of Alzira's garden and the drizzle that had stopped at the right time and the 22 carefully folded certificates. "Yes," he said, "for the first time, truly." "Why?" "Because I'm building something that will last longer than me." Marianne considered this with seriousness. She nodded, satisfied with the answer, and ran back to Benedict. Camilla looked at the space her daughter had left in the garden. She smiled to herself. The garden was full of conversations, laughter, the smell of orange cake still coming from the kitchen window, voices of graduates and family members and teachers and staff, who had mingled in a way that made it difficult to distinguish who had arrived through which door, who had arrived for which reason. Benedict passed by Edward with a tray of coffee and stopped beside him for a second, as was his custom when there was something important to be said economically. He looked at the garden full of people, at the bougainvillea seedling with 3 flowers, at the white chairs that still needed to be folded, at everything that had grown since that morning of marble and bin bags and silence broken by a woman who had decided that enough was enough. "Your father would be proud," Benedict said simply, and continued walking with the tray. Edward stood still for a long moment with that phrase in his chest. Later, when night had slowly fallen and the garden lights were on, and the chosen family dined together around the tables someone had pushed together to create space, Camilla looked around the root-center garden and thought of what had begun as the weight of a bin bag on a white marble morning. She thought of how a single act of courage in defense of one's own dignity can be the beginning of much more than the person who performed it can see at the moment they do it. She thought of Benedict with his pruning shears and his silent loyalty, of Irene with her apron and her practical faith, of Edward descending from the veranda with a decision made, of Frederick arriving through the side gate with regret and a willingness to change. And she thought above all that a root is what holds the tree when it's very windy, and that they had planted good roots in that garden. Roots that didn't appear on any business map, in any contract, in any window overlooking Oxford Street, but which were the most real of all, and which would last. End of story. If the journey of Camilla, Marianne, Benedict, Irene, and Edward touched your heart, know that stories like this exist to remind us that kindness is not weakness, that dignity is priceless, and that sometimes all we need is one person who decides, in a difficult moment, to do what is right. If you've made it this far, you are also part of this story. Leave in the comments the word that resonated most with you after these 6 chapters. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories, and share with someone who needs today to believe that a single act of courage can change the course of everything.